Hi everyone and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. Today we're going to be looking at chapters 6 through 10 of The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I've done a video previously on chapters 1 through 5, so you can go back to the channel and look at that. So starting off with chapter 6, the way we're going to go through this is I'm just going to bring up some points about plot lines, characters and themes, anything that I think is relevant. We have some quotes mixed in there as well, just to sort of guide you through the knowledge that you need to attain in order to write your essays confidently, but also to answer your contextual questions accurately. So chapter 6, Henry says Dorian has noticed beauty more since the painting of the portrait. So ever since Basil's portrait of Dorian has been painted, and Dorian's beauty has been, applauded, he has noticed his own beauty and has become aware of that more. Henry says about Dorian's plan to marry Sybil, he says, "Oh, this marriage is going to last 6 months. What a great study it will be." Dorian keeps referring to Sybil as characters, and he even says that she is in Verona, where the play Romeo and Juliet takes place. So we see here, going off from the previous chapter, that Dorian is in love with Sybil, but we see that this love is clearly not pure or actually, it doesn't actually exist in reality, because he's obsessed with her as a character, as an actress, and he even says that she's in Verona, which is the famous setting of the play Romeo and Juliet. He doesn't even refer to her as Sybil, he refers to her as her characters' names. Henry, I have a theory. So as you see throughout, I've always put in Henry's little epigrams or things that he says, which are just absurd and just shows that he's just trying to resist every possible strand of conventionality in society. He says the middle class is not modern. Dorian says it's impossible to be mad with Henry, so that really demonstrates Henry's influence over Dorian. Dorian wants to put Sybil on a pedestal of gold. I mean, isn't that so telling? Because that's a common phrase that we say if you put someone on a pedestal, and we say, that in a sort of a way full of critique, where like you're putting them on a pedestal, you're not treating them as though they're human, you're expecting something so great of them, and Dorian literally wants to put her on a pedestal. He is changed by Sybil. He forgets Henry's delightful and wrong theories. Isn't that such a paradoxical idea that theories and ideas can be delightful and wrong? Henry says pleasure is the only thing worth having a theory about. Well, isn't that the entire basis of hedonism, that pleasure is the only thing worth seeking in life? And therefore, this is something Henry would proclaim to be true. When we are happy, we are always good, but when we are good, we are not always happy. Isn't that also such an interesting perspective, which is somewhat truthful if we think about it deeply? To be good is to be in harmony with oneself. So that is Henry's philosophy in life. Hedonism is it's focused on pleasure, but it's also focused on yourself. It's not a selfless perspective of the world. It's not about helping others. It's not even about putting them into the picture, but it's this egocentric idea and concept of which to govern your life. So to be good is to be in harmony with oneself. So if you need a quote about Henry's philosophy of life, this is a really nice one. Henry says women treat men like gods. They always want something. Throughout the novel, you see Henry doesn't particularly respect women, and he has all these little sayings about what he thinks. Well, he portrays them as facts of what women think, but really it's just his perception and his opinion. Henry says to Dorian, "You will always admire me as I represent all the sins you don't have the courage to commit." So interesting idea that in order to sin, you need to have courage. We have this idea that acting is more real than life. Isn't that really telling of the danger and the moral of this entire story? If you've got to the end of the novel, you'll see how, what does this actually mean? Acting is more real than life. It seems extremely strange, a strange thing to say. Paradoxical. Basil feels as though Dorian will never be what he once was. Life had got in the way. So this idea that he was untainted at first. Dorian was untainted when Basil first saw him and started painting him, and Henry sort of representative of life and cynicism, and how life itself got in the way of Dorian's innocence. Chapter 7. So in this chapter we go to the theatre. Dorian takes Henry to go and see Sybil and her performance, and he's very excited. So we start off when we have this negative representation of the Jewish manager of the theatre. The theatre is described as oppressively hot and doesn't come across as a great environment. Henry is condescending towards the rough people, and he scoffs at the fact that they are being grouped in the same category. So this idea of class differentiation, remember we discussed in the previous video how, this is set during the Victorian era, so we have this very, very, divided society. Class differentiation was extremely strict, and so we're going to see how the negative representations of the Jewish manager, negative representations of the supposed middle class, who is below the sort of upper middle class of Basil and Henry, or even they're more, Henry's a lord, so he's more of the aristocracy, and even towards women then. So there's this clear class differentiation. Basil is very considerate and supportive about the marriage. So Basil comes along and he is supportive towards Dorian. We have a nice line there, Henry is so cynical. Everything is described as horrid except for Sybil. So the stage is described as terrible, the audience are these rough people, but everything but Sybil is basically horrible. So I think that alludes to this idea of a rose among thorns idea. And a rose among thorns is obviously so much more appealing than perhaps a rose in a field of roses, right? Because it's something distinguishable, it's something different. Yet Sybil's performance is actually not good. She doesn't come across as a good actress on this very night. She doesn't say her lines with passion, and she's not immersed. She looks charming, yet her acting is artificial. She's also described with this air of immaturity. Henry says it's great that she knows nothing, and they drink to the beauty of Sybil, importantly not to Sybil herself, but to her beauty, because that's really what they're focused on. Dorian says to Sybil, with this terrible acting, you have killed my love, and he says, without your art, you are nothing. There's a touch of cruelty in the painting. So after Dorian confronts Sybil about her acting and says, the marriage is off, what a terrible person you are, I have no desire for you anymore, he sees the painting and there's this touch of cruelty in it. So now we're going to see a little bit of the supernatural come into this very, up to this point it's been quite a realistic novel, right? Things have happened in a way that they could, and here we just see this element of the supernatural, and I think it's extremely powerful. And when we get to the end of the novel, I'll sort of speak on that as well in terms of the ending, but how we have this really realistic story, and then we just have this touch of the supernatural, I'm going to call it, or something that's unrealistic, but how that really amplifies what the story is about and what the main moral is. And so I think it's quite effective personally. Experience and personality reflects in the painting. So you know how the Victorians believed that if you were beautiful on the outside, that represented your inner beauty. And so now we see this is actually coming to fruition in a more real way. Because what happens on the outside, or what Dorian does, is now reflected in the physical. Portrait bears the burden of his sins and of passion, so the idea that sin and passion are grouped together. There's cruelty in the mouth that's seen, so maybe that alludes to the fact that he had, he said all these violent words to Sybil. There's the idea of disappointment. We have Sybil being compared to a child, so understanding her vulnerability. Dorian is quite callous. He can't admit that he's wrong. He asks why a soul was given to him like this. He says, I have suffered. I had to watch this play. I have suffered so much. Women are all about emotion. So that's another one of Henry's sayings and what he thinks of women, which he passes off as fact. Dorian says Henry knew all about women. So apparently Henry is the expert on women. The painting had taught him to love his own beauty, but it would make him loathe his own soul. That is such a powerful line because it's so incredibly true. The painting had really exposed his beauty and how he could use that beauty as a weapon. But it also is going to make him loathe his own soul, because as it changes, he's going to see the physical manifestation of his sins. He feels pity for the painting, and he feels as though it's a stain. This idea of a stain is going to come up later on as well. This idea of now there's the sense of impurity, that Dorian has been tainted. The painting is an emblem of consciousness. At first, Dorian says he will resist temptation and not let the painting deteriorate. He says he's not going to go and see Henry, he's going to go back to Sybil, so he's going to follow this idea of duty. So he sees this painting is changing after he said all these terrible words, and he is mortified by it, and he's ashamed of it, and he says, I'm going to change my ways. Obviously this is going to be short-lived, but later towards the end of the novel we're going to see him also trying to, he's going to proclaim he's going to change his ways, and we see that ultimately he's also unsuccessful. The idea of duty versus passion, because he says he has to go back to Sybil because he is dutifully bound to her. He proposed marriage, so he needs to act on that. So duty and passion are polar opposites. He covers the portrait. So here we have the theme of appearance versus reality being introduced. He's ashamed of the portrait, he's going to cover the portrait, but now we can see that his actual beauty has been left untainted, and so that is going to show us that what he appears to be is not actually what he really is, because what he really is in the portrait itself. Chapter 8. There's quite a lot to say on chapter 8. Was it his imagination that on the portrait he had seen a look of evil from a look of joy? He thinks about telling the tale to Basil, make him smile. He's almost afraid of himself, doesn't want the servant to leave and be left alone to examine the portrait. He's worried if Basil came over and asked to see the picture. He examines the portrait and he sees that it has altered. So this chapter 8 starts the next morning, and he sort of wakes up and he just thinks to himself, was it just in my imagination? But had the portrait actually changed? He thinks of turning the tale to Basil, to make him smile, but then he actually gets quite scared, and we see this introduction of this thread of the story, which is going to come up later on, that Dorian is afraid of himself. He is afraid of what he can do and what he is. So he's ashamed and afraid, and so he doesn't even want the servant to leave the room. He becomes worried. What if Basil comes over and sees it? He looks at the portrait scientifically and he sees that it has changed. He gazes at the picture in sickened horror. It's important to note that he does gaze at this picture with sickened horror, because this is going to change. Later on, he's going to sort of accept the portraits, the cards he's been dealt almost, or how the portrait is bearing the burden of his sin. But here, at this stage, he looks at it in sickened horror. Once he talks to Henry again, he's suddenly all happy-go-lucky, and then he will see he thinks that Sybil did something terrible to him by committing suicide. It's quite ironic, because he says it's not too late to make reparations for his behavior towards Sybil. He's like, okay, I'm going to go apologize now, I'm going to do my duty. But we can obviously know that that's not going to happen, because Sybil is dead. Dorian changes when Henry appears. Dorian says about the Sybil situation, he says, Sybil's situation taught me to know myself better. I want to be good. Now, to make his soul good, he will marry Sybil. So he's not going to be breaking his word. So this idea that he is going to give in to the duty, he's not going to break his word, he's going to be a good person. This quote, I want to be good, is important because it shows that he does have this element of goodness at this point, at least. And remember, when you're writing your essay and you need to prove a very typical question you'd get for the Dorian Gray essay question in an exam would be something along the lines of, should Dorian be blamed for his descent and his demise, or is it other people's influence that assists him on this venture? And remember, you can argue either way, but it's just about the proof that you bring. So here you can show the proof that Dorian perhaps is innately good. He does want to be good. He does want to not give in, but he wants to select the duty after he's had the shock of seeing the portrait change. But then he's going to be influenced another way. So just always keep in mind, what is the ultimate thing that I'm trying to prove? and then use all these quotes and all these ideas to prove that stance that you're going to take. He says to Henry, you cut life to pieces with your epigrams. So the epigrams, those are all the little, things he says, this note about this and this comment about this. And so isn't that quite true, that he really cuts life to pieces? He takes out everything of life. He has a cry of pain when he hears that she has killed herself. So he's still human, I've written there. He's still, has some sort of feeling and emotion, but we're going to see he's going to chat to Henry now, and now it's going to, by the end of their discussion, he's sort of lost any sort of humanity. He's upset, but it also seems wonderful, because now obviously he has no obligation, he has no duty. He says she had a right to kill herself. She had no right to kill herself. It was selfish on her part. He shifts off the blame. So it's really quite terrible. His reaction to Sybil's death at first is, shocked and horrified. But then he shifts off the blame and he says it wasn't his fault. I mean, how could she possibly do that? She had no right to kill herself. It was selfish. So how, abhorrent is that to say? Henry says, the only way a woman can help a man is by boring him so that he loses interest in life. Henry says he would not have allowed the marriage, and I wrote there ... because what does he mean by this? What is he signifying? Is he signifying his utter and overall control over Dorian, or is he just being Henry again when he says things that he doesn't follow through? And as we get further on, we're going to notice how Henry says a lot of things, but he doesn't act on them. And Dorian is the one who's actually acting out this hedonistic lifestyle that Henry has so much to say about, but Henry never actually goes through with anything that he says. Dorian admits he can't feel as terrible as he should about the situation. He keeps saying it's a wonderful tragedy, which is obviously an oxymoron, right? When we have, two words that mean opposite things right next to each other. He says it's a wonderful tragedy. Henry says he wishes someone died for his love. He's just the most absurd, terrible man. Henry says women have intellectual stagnation due to memory. So he draws on the stereotype that women remember everything, and the fact that they remember everything, they are intellectually stunted now. They sort of stop growing intellectually. They don't have, sort of big brains, if you want to put it in simpler terms. Henry believes that details are always vulgar. Well, of course he would believe that, right? He would not want to look at the details because the details are irrelevant to a person like Henry, who is just seeking pleasure. He says women are charmingly artificial. Sybil did something great for you. She died for you. I mean, isn't that such a terrible thing to say? So we're going to see this later on as well when, spoiler alert, but when Dorian kills Basil. And he's going to talk about how Basil's death is almost romantic, which is really quite crazy to say when we actually discuss, how Basil died. But here as well, Sybil's death is seen as almost a good thing or a positive death because of how it occurred, which is completely absurd. Conscience makes egotists of us all. Her death is beautiful, apparently, because it shows passion and love. Women are primitive even though men have emancipated them. Appreciate cruelty, they love being dominated. So this is Henry's apparent knowledge of women. Women are apparently primitive even though men have freed them. Men have supposedly freed women, but they are still basic. And that they appreciate cruelty and they love being dominated. So it's a really, really problematic discussion that is had here, both in terms of Henry's depiction of women, but also in terms of the depiction of Sybil's death and how tragic this death really is, and it's completely seen in a different way. They talk about what is life, and so we have this very, it's quite a deep discussion about what is life, and they come to the agreement that Sybil never really lived, so she never really died. So she never actually did anything with her life, according to them, so therefore she never actually even died because she didn't live. I hope that makes sense. It's obviously not referring to life in a literal sense, but more in a figurative sense. She was always a dream for Dorian. Henry reflects on this. The moment she touched actual love, she marred it, and it marred her. Dorian is seen to cry over a character's deaths, but not over Sybil. She was less real than they are. Dorian says to Henry, "You have explained myself to me, how well you know me." The death is described as a marvelous experience. Henry says, "There is nothing with your good looks that you will not be able to do." So we sort of get the conclusion of this tale now of Sybil, and Dorian's going to try and forget about it, live according to Henry's idea that the past is the past. But essentially they argue that she never really lived because she never really died because she never really lived. But also how, because her acting went bad once she had actually fallen in love, and so they reflect on that sort of tragedy. But then Dorian says to Henry, and this really shows Henry's control of Dorian, he says, "You have explained myself to me, how well you know me." So he basically says to Henry that you know me better than me. And this is going to shift later on when Dorian's going to say to Henry, "You don't know everything about me," when he's trying to change. So here we're sort of getting into the real manipulation and the extent of the manipulation. We're going to see how absolutely Henry is going to govern Dorian's life. Henry said, "There's nothing with your good looks that you will not be able to do." Obviously that's the entire foundation or basis of the novel. Dorian says, "What if he becomes haggard? He's concerned. We live in an age that reads too much to be wise and thinks too much to be beautiful." That's another one of Henry's little epigrams. I mean, isn't that just totally absurd? We live in an age that reads too much to be wise. So the idea that reading does not make you wise, and that thinks too much to be beautiful. So this idea of beauty and thought and rationality being diametrically opposed, which is very linked to hedonism. They're sort of best friends now. There's no change in the portrait. So then he comes to the conclusion, Dorian. Remember, he doesn't show Henry this, but this is, whenever he looks at the portrait, he's always doing it alone. It's his secret, right up until later on in the novel. So there's no change in the portrait because it's already changed after Sybil died. She had atoned by dying. Apparently she'd done something terribly wrong by acting badly one night, and she had, been given forgiveness, been granted forgiveness. She died for love. He tries to forget what she did to him, and ideally on the notes, this is actually, the notes on the website have she and him in italics to really emphasize this, because she tries to forget what she did to him. I mean, really, she did not do anything to him. The ideas of women manipulation, deception, and trickery. So this idea that she has tricked him, she manipulated him, and so therefore she had to pay. Life and curiosity. So now Dorian makes the conscious decision, and so this is important if you want to prove that Dorian is responsible for his own actions, because he now purposefully decides to pursue youth, sin, and passion. The portrait was to bear the burden of his shame. That's a nice quote as well. It was to become something that was locked away. It was something, it had a sort of, he was ashamed of it, the pity of it. The idea that no human would give up youth. He makes excuses trying to change the curse. And so this can be described in this concept called the Faustian bargain. And this is where you make a pact whereby a person trades something of supreme moral or spiritual importance, such as personal values or the soul, for some worldly or material benefit, such as knowledge, power, or riches. So it's sort of like he sees the opportunity, and then he's justifying it in his head why he's going to pursue youth, why he's not going to actually change this curse and be good. So he's bargaining with himself. He's trading something for something of a different importance. The diametrically opposed idea is morality and pleasure. So the idea that if you are moral, then you cannot seek pleasure, and if you seek pleasure, then you are not moral. And that's, I think, something that happens a lot. It's a sort of a discussion that we're even having, in modern times today. Can morality and pleasure sort of go hand in hand, or are they still diametrically opposed? He accepts that the picture will deteriorate, and that it's a mirror into his soul. He would be safe. That was everything. So this idea that you must be saved from yourself. Remember, we discussed that earlier. So this idea that the portrait is going to keep him safe from himself. He's still going to be fine because he's still going to look on the outside beautiful and pure and innocent. Chapter 9. So, on the night of Sybil's death, he's found out about Sybil's death in the morning. That evening, he decides to go to the opera. So that really shows you Dorian's descent has been absolutely drastic and it's been very quick. Basil comes to comfort and give condolences. He thinks Dorian went to visit Sybil's mother. Dorian says, if you don't talk about things, then they never happened. So Basil comes over, and remember in the previous video we discussed how Basil was sort of this rational person that we as the readers sort of see the world through, or see what's happening through his eyes, because he's this rational and reasonable figure. So he comes to give comfort and condolences. Obviously, this is the woman that Dorian was so intent on marrying just the night before. Dorian wakes up, he's going to be good again, but by the evening he wants to forget the whole thing, and we can see Henry's influence, because he says if you don't talk about things, they never happened, which links to Henry's idea the past is the past, we should not access it. Basil acts as the voice of reason, as the humane and rational figure. Dorian says what is past, move on. He has almost dominated emotions. Basil, something has changed in you, but you look the same. And that's something that the Victorians just don't get. They don't understand. How can you be changed? You know, people say that you're bad. We're going to see later on. People say he's bad, but he looks so good. So how can that possibly track? All Harry's influence, no heart, Basil says. Basil's more upset than Dorian that Sybil killed herself. Dorian says actors die well, like a heroine. Pathetic uselessness of martyrdom. Dorian says he has suffered. Then it passed. I'm not repeating emotions. So he's sort of beyond this humane thing. Dorian says Basil came over to console him, yet he finds him consoled, so he's angry. So he says, Basil, you came to console me, you came to comfort me, but I'm already comforted, I'm already consoled, so why are you angry? So he really doesn't get it. Dorian says he has developed. Basil is a rational and comparative figure, so Basil obviously knew him before and after, so we use his eyes and his perspective to compare Dorian's progression. Basil says, so much in Dorian was good and noble. It was pretty of her to call him Prince Charming. Remember, she never actually really knew his name. She just knew him as Prince Charming, and as described, it was pretty of her. Dorian sort of breaks things off with Basil here. He says, I can never sit for you again. Basil inquires why the portrait is covered, and Dorian becomes terrified that Basil's going to look at the portrait. The portrait is set for an exhibition, and so Dorian feels like they're on the brink of horrible danger, because if it's going for an exhibition, he's going to have to show it. But Basil is this, innately good person, one could say, and he says, friendship is dearer to me than fame. So he says, don't worry, I'm not going to exhibit it. Dorian demands to know why Basil has changed his mind, and Basil's reasoning is quite interesting. I did mention now that Basil is innately good, and that's something we're going to question later on in terms of his influence on Dorian's demise. But I think that most of us would agree that he is somewhat good. Basil believes that youth is idolatry. He feels that he idolizes Dorian, and then he feels foolish that he thought his passion was depicted in art. Art is too abstract. He got an offer from Paris, so he agreed to show the painting, but now he understands he must not. So we get an understanding that Basil is now reflecting on how he has treated Dorian, and perhaps he's realizing that he idolized and worshipped him too much. And that is going to be important later on if you ever do want to prove. I mean, Henry's influence is obviously absolutely evident, but you could also perhaps lean on Basil as an influence in Dorian's demise, because he does make Dorian aware of his own beauty, and he fosters this sort of idea that it is to be praised and he can do anything with it. You are made to be worshipped. There we go. So there's Basil's perspective on Dorian's beauty. The peril has passed for Dorian. It's over. Basil doesn't want to see the portrait. Basil thinks Dorian sees the same as Basil in the portrait. So Basil thinks, oh, Dorian, he understands me. He understands why I can't show this. It's like this whole idea of youth is idolatry. Obviously, that's not true. Idea that Dorian is influenced by Basil's art in a good way. And that's going to be something interesting that we're going to come out with from this book with, is because later on Henry is going to give Dorian a book. And so this idea of how art influences people in a good or a bad way. And then we can reflect on our own reading of this novel and how it has affected us in a good or a bad way. He would still go to Basil in trouble, The portrait has a life of its own. Basil is understanding and respectful. Dorian smiles. He didn't tell secret, but he got Basil's secret confession, and he almost feels sorry. So he gets Basil's confession that he's put too much of himself in the art. The portrait must be hidden at all costs. Chapter 10. So Dorian hides the portrait. The portrait breeds horror but never dies, like worms on a corpse. So this idea of worms on a corpse is really quite horrifying, but a corpse is already dead. So it's almost like, a part of his soul's already died, but it keeps on dying because these worms keep festering. It's shameful, yet it still lives on. Still some good. There's still some good in Dorian. We're going to track this. When does he lose all of his good? Does he ever lose all of his good? He regrets that he didn't tell Basil so that he could help him resist Harry's influence and his own influence. The idea of human beings being innately bad, so we need to be thinking to ourselves, what are human beings? Are they innately good or are they innately bad? Because Dorian is sort of seen as this blank canvas. And then Henry channels the bad within him to create this immoral and hedonistic being. So here, once again, do you see his own influence? He wants to be protected from his own influence. So this idea that he needs to be protected from himself. So does that tell us that human beings are innately bad and they need someone who's mastered a good influence to help them? But he feels it's too late for Basil to assist him. His future is inevitable. Passions within him would find their outlet. Evil will become real. So this is the progressive idea of sin. The portrait is going to change, and Dorian believes that now his future has been set up. It's inevitable. Whatever he does now, it's just going to continue to descend more and more into more negative things. The portrait unchanged, but there's more disgust within Dorian. The portrait is calling him to judgment, the symbol of accountability or responsibility. He's paranoid. He wants to get rid of a servant because he knows where the portrait is. Dorian is so charming to the frame maker, he actually comes directly to the house. So I think that was supposed to be 2 bullet points, so my apologies for that. So Dorian is extremely paranoid just to go back to the 3rd last point, portrait, or the 4th last one, passions within him would find their outlet. So remember, Henry keeps saying that it's all about the action. It's not about the thought, it's about the action. That pleasure is fulfilled in the action. So now all of Dorian's passions are going to find their outlet, meaning they're actually going to be acted on. They're not just going to be thought. Sorry, going back to the bottom. So he becomes extremely paranoid because this is, the portrait represents this symbol of, accountability, responsibility, but also of his shame. And he wants to even get rid of a servant because the servant knows in which room the portrait is held. We see the frame maker coming to the house, and that's important because the frame maker doesn't actually come to people's houses, but he comes to Dorian because Dorian is so charming. Once again, appearance versus reality. The portrait is heavy, so they're trying to carry it up these stairs, and obviously that has a double meaning because it can be literally heavy, but figuratively it's also carrying his, the burden of all his sins. The portrait is put in an old playroom. Only Dorian has a key. And it's described as a prison. Dorian was unwanted as a child. We get a little bit of insight into that. The stainless purity of boyhood. Now it doesn't matter. It's locked away, so the portrait can deteriorate, but there's some hope that purity and love will come. So once again, this theme of purity. But then says it will grow old. So even if it escapes sins, it will become old and horrible. It's described as old age deterioration. Question inadvertently posed about the futility of life. What's the point of our destiny's decay? So the picture keeps the portrait of his life, and he sort of, as he locks it away in this playroom, his old playroom, he reflects on it and he says, well, even if I didn't sin, I would still be getting older, right? And so what's sort of the point of life? I need to now live my life to the fullest. I've got this out. I've got this way to sort of prevent myself from growing old and from, physically showcasing my sin. The portrait equals shame. Dorian is described as marvelous because he's this marvelous being he doesn't have, or he thinks he doesn't have at this point. He thinks he can escape from the portrait. Later on, we're going to find that he can't. The book that Henry sends is described as poisonous. And this is the book that pushes Dorian over the edge. It's going to make him absolutely this immoral, hedonistic, experimental figure that Henry so desires. There are creeping shadows in the book, so is that a metaphor? There are creeping shadows indicating the danger that Dorian is now in. I hope that has been helpful, and hopefully I will be updating the channel more regularly now and posting chapters 11 through 15 and 16 through 20. Please subscribe. Thank you.